Hi guys, I'm Mike.
And I'm Stephen.
And this is Indy Fanatics, your home for IndyCar content with weekly podcasts and feature videos. Welcome back to the channel and to another feature video. Last time out we looked at the career of Alex Palou, so if you haven't already, check that one out. Don't forget, if there is a driver, team or topic you'd like us to look at in the future, comment below.
But today we go back and look at another key moment in the sport's history. This weekend's race is at Texas, so we thought we'd bring down the mood and talk about a real low point in kart's history. Okay, no, we aren't deliberately trying to bring down the mood, but it is a very interesting tale from American open wheel history. We also have a special guest to help us tell the story today, so watch out for that later in the video. So I guess it's time to ask, was the cancelled race in Texas really the beginning of the end for kart?
Well, let's take a deeper look into things before answering that question. You can argue that after the split with the formation of the IRL breaking away from CART, that one of the series was going to eventually collapse, and the IRL had the Indy 500, so naturally, as it did play out, you'd think that one had the better chance of survival. Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that. We covered the second split in greater detail in part 4 of our History of IndyCar series, but let's go over some bits again as they help to paint the picture of how we got to the situation like Texas in 2001. To help us do this is fellow IndyCar and American Motorsports creator IanPerez. Now, we have been on his channel a couple of times recently talking about the careers of Danica Patrick and Bill Vukovich. We'll leave links to both those videos in the description below, and all the links to Ian's channels and social medias. But over to you, Ian.
Thanks guys. So the split had obviously led of a lot of will between the two parties. To oversimplify the issues, kart was becoming a serious drawing in big money that started to favor a calendar more dominated by road and street courses and was bringing in more drivers from around the world, and this was the expense of homegrown talent in the eyes of Tony George and others. Tony also believed the sport was becoming too expensive, too participating, and only favoring a few teams like Team Penske and Newman Haas. So he created his own breakaway series called the Indy Racing League, where the premium events would be the Indianapolis 500 and all tracks would be ovals to give more of an opportunity to young American racers making their way up through the ranks in dirt racing and midgets, and as a whole making the series more affordable for the teams and drivers to enter. Kart as a whole kept the top teams and drivers, where the Indy Racing League had the Indianapolis 500 and a lot of work to do. The bitterness between the two series certainly did not help IndyCar as a whole, as Kart created the US 500 to rival the Indianapolis 500 and ran it on the same day in 1996. Oh boy, I wonder how that went. Obviously, this was unpopular and did not look good at all, as for the first time in a long time, while top drivers in the sport weren't competing at Indy, it was the desire from CART to create their own special event to rival the 500 and sink the IRL series that led us to the event of Texas in 2001. I now think it's time to hand it back to the boys at Indy Fanatics to continue the story. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ian. Well, before we get to the kart race, let's talk about the IRL races being hosted there. The Texas Motor Speedway first race in the IRL was in 1997. It had a huge attendance of an estimated 185,000 and was the first American open wheel race to ever be run under the lights. A shout out to our viewer Scott for those facts. But the main thing to take from this was the track was a success, and it stayed on the calendar every year throughout the duration of the IRL. And when the series unified, it remained on the calendar to this very day, with the doubleheader this weekend. But now we refer to a point made by Ian, when kart tried to make their own big event in the US 500. For 4 years they tried to compete on their own without the Indy 500, but in 2000 that started to fall apart when Chip Ganassi were the first and only team to compete in the Indy 500 since their split, and their driver and at the time current kart champion Juan Pablo Montoya won the race. Then in 2001, Team Penske entered and did a clean sweep of the top 3, with driver Helio Castroneves claiming the 500 crown. So after the dust had settled, kart's attempt to rival the Indianapolis 500 was officially dead.
It was, but kart's attempt to try and prove they were bigger and better than the IRL were not. The 2001 season had already started off poorly for the series when the Rio 200, scheduled to be the second race of the season, had been cancelled due to the government missing a deadline for guaranteeing sanctioning fees and failed to grant race promoter Fittipaldi access to the facility so he could begin preparations for the race. The Texas race was scheduled for April 29th. The event had been named the Firestone Firehawk 600, meaning the kart drivers would run 48 more laps than their IRL counterparts. The drivers had turned up at the track with some testing behind them, with a mix of kart sanction testing and private tests. Kenny Brack was the first to test the track for kart on the 19th of December 2000. He completed 100 laps, exceeding speeds of 221 miles per hour. Chief Steward J. Kirk Russell, track officials, Brack and Team Rahal all gave the green light from the test. No full field track running were arranged, but several private days followed the initial kart test. On February 21st, after a rain-affected morning, Patrick Racing and driver Jimmy Vasser completed 100 laps, reaching top speeds of 215 miles per hour and reporting it was fairly easy to drive flat out and the track was slightly bumpy. The following day, Dario Franchitti completed 190 laps with a top speed of 225.7 miles per hour. Franchitti had expressed reservations about the track's roughness and reported pulling high Gs in the corners. The other drivers who tested all reached similar sorts of speeds, with the main complaint being the track roughness. However, PacWest driver Maurizio Gugelmin expressed concerns post-death with Gossage and CART officials on March 19th in a teleconference, stating he did not believe CART could race there as the wing configuration was wrong and the cars were too fast for the track.
Well, the IRL had already decided that the 225 miles per hour range was too fast, and after the 1998 race at the track had reduced their speeds to the 215 to 216 miles per hour range for the event. CART, however, did not make any such changes, and the main change was to smooth some areas of the track that the drivers had complained about. Friday, April 27th was the first time the drivers got on the track for the race weekend. Tony Kanaan set the fastest time in the morning practice with a 22.845 second lap. This was a full second quicker than any of the times posted in practice, and Tony had reached speeds in excess of 230 miles per hour. Maurizio Gugelmin was the first crash of the weekend in afternoon practice on the Friday, crashing into the inside wall of turn 2 before hitting the outside wall of turn 3 before resting at the apex. He claimed to have blacked out during the crash, but was not seriously injured and would sit out the rest of the weekend. The first real serious concerns, though, was when Dr. Steve Olvey found that two drivers had got out of their car feeling dizzy and disorientated after driving at speeds above 230 miles per hour, and he went to investigate further. Over the course of the weekend, more and more drivers started to report these symptoms, and after the second crash of the weekend with driver Cristiano D'Amata, he reported he couldn't explain how he had crashed. Qualifying still went ahead, with Kenny Brack setting the official track record of 233.447 miles per hour. But drivers to their teams at the end of qualifying were reporting they were sustaining 5 lateral Gs for 14 to 18 seconds of the 23-second lap. An impromptu driver meeting was held after rising concerns for driver safety on Saturday afternoon. In that meeting, 21 of the 25 drivers admitted suffering feelings of disorientation and vertigo, like symptoms including inner ear and vision problems. Brack and Tracy reported after the meeting that they were the only 2 drivers who were comfortable for the race to still go ahead.
That evening, CART came to the conclusion that the race could not be run safely in excessive speeds of 225 miles per hour without the fear of loss of consciousness of the drivers. They discussed all possible alternatives, but with the engines being unable to be turned down enough without risk of engine failure, the introduction of a makeshift chicane out of cones was even seriously considered as an attempt to slow the cars. But ultimately, when Sunday came around, they had run out of safe alternatives and the race was cancelled just 2 hours before the start, and 60,000 fans were sent home. The event was a disaster. It was met with understandable huge backlash from the fans. It was being broadcast on ESPN, so was hugely and publicly embarrassing for the series, and Gossage and the Texas Motor Speedway were fuming as they had been assured the race would go ahead despite CART not conducting more extensive tests beforehand. To be honest, Gossage had every right to be angry because he had a good point and the Speedway knew that. and therefore opened a lawsuit against CART, suing them for breach of contract. It was the evidence that CART had rejected requests from TMS to test further at the track before the event that was ultimately the most damning factor. The two parties would settle, and although the exact costs were not disclosed, it is thought to have cost CART $5 to $7 million, and the future events at the track planned in 2002 and 2003 were annulled.
2001 was a complete disaster for the series. The aforementioned two-race cancellation, a disastrous European tour that coincided with the September 11th attacks, infighting between the engine manufacturers which ultimately saw Honda and Toyota leave the series, the TV contract was lost, Michigan and Nazareth were lost for the following year's calendar, and to top it all off, one of the founders of the CART and biggest names in the sport, Team Penske, would officially withdraw from the series, heading over full-time to the IRL. I mean, if you're going to collapse as a series, you might as well do it in the spectacular fashion that CART did in 2001. The series declared bankruptcy in 2003 and rebranded as Champ Car from 2004 onwards, but the war between the two series had been lost. The IRL had come out on top, and CART had crumbled from its success in the 80s and early 90s.
So before we conclude, let's make one thing abundantly clear. Cancelling the 2001 Firestone Firehawk 600 was 110% completely the right decision, as driver safety should always come first. But to answer the phrase posed at the start of this video, was the 2001 event at Texas Motor Speedway the beginning of the end for CART? Well, you could argue that the split and how everything was handled by CART trying to rival and beat down the IRL were the early warning signs it might not work out for the series. The first cancellation of the season of the Rio 200 probably elevated the disaster that was Texas, so maybe that was the beginning. But we think that the events at Texas over the course of the 27th to 29th of April set in motion the path that CART could never recover from. The public humiliation of the event and the financial repercussions were so disastrous that the reputation of the series was too far gone. CART blew it. They had the teams, they had the drivers, they had everything after the split that meant that they should have been the series that came out on top. But through poor management and failed events, it lost, and a chapter in American open wheel racing was closed.
But that's it for today's video, guys. We hope you have enjoyed reliving the events of 2001 at Texas Motor Speedway and the collapse of CART. Thank you again to Ian for helping us out with this one. Make sure you check out his great content and drop him a subscribe. We will be leaving a link to his channel and his socials in the description below. Don't forget, if there's a driver, team or topic you'd like us to look at in the future, comment down below.
And if they're new around here or haven't done so already,
they can like, subscribe and ding that bell.
Ding it! So for now, you Indy fans, keep racing!